My name is Aaron Phillips. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a logistics analyst for a transportation company in Kentucky. At the beginning of 2024, I was sent to a 2-day training session in Cookeville, a small town in Tennessee. Since the company only covered a fixed amount for lodging, I decided to book an Airbnb instead of staying at a hotel. I found an old house at a great price in a quiet residential neighborhood just a few minutes from downtown. The listing stated that I would have the entire house to myself for both nights of the reservation, without sharing the space with anyone else. The reviews were positive, and several guests described the place as quiet and comfortable, so I booked it without thinking twice. I arrived late Tuesday afternoon after driving for about 4 hours. The owner had left the key in a lockbox on the front porch and sent me a message explaining that he was traveling, and that I could let myself in whenever I arrived. The house was small, probably built in the 1950s with a living room, kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a narrow hallway leading to the bathroom. The wooden floors creaked quite a bit, but that was expected in an old house. I unloaded my things, took a quick shower, and went out for dinner. I returned around 10 that night completely exhausted and went straight to bed without paying much attention to the details of the house. I woke up for the first time around 2 in the morning without immediately knowing why. It took me several seconds to realize what had awakened me. Someone was walking above the bedroom. The footsteps were slow and evenly spaced, as though someone were pacing back and forth across a wooden floor. At first I wasn't frightened. I assumed I had only rented the first floor and that the owners lived upstairs, something I simply hadn't noticed when I arrived after dark. I rolled over and tried to fall back asleep. The footsteps continued for several more minutes. They were never hurried. They didn't sound like someone carrying anything heavy either. They were simply slow footsteps crossing above the bedroom before returning along the exact same path. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I assumed whoever it was had gone to bed, and I finally managed to fall asleep again. Shortly before sunrise, I woke up for the second time. The same footsteps had returned, now seeming a little closer to the area above the bedroom door. I lay there listening for nearly a minute before everything once again fell silent. I even considered sending the owner a message asking whether anyone else was staying in the house, but I decided to wait until morning. I figured it was nothing more than a slightly inconvenient situation. The next morning, I woke up early for the training session. While making coffee, I took the opportunity to look around the house more carefully. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no staircase leading to a second floor. I walked through every room, thinking perhaps there was a hidden door concealing a folding staircase or some less obvious access point, but I found nothing. Before leaving, I sent the owner a message asking whether any other part of the house was occupied during my stay. About 15 minutes later, he replied with a brief message. "No, the entire house is yours." I thought that was odd and explained that I had heard footsteps above the bedroom for much of the previous night. His response came almost immediately. He said the house didn't have a second floor, only a small attic used for insulation, and that there was no reason for anyone to be up there. He added that old houses often made noises because of the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. The explanation sounded reasonable, even though I knew the difference between creaking wood and footsteps. I spent the entire day at the training session trying not to think about it. I convinced myself that the long drive and exhaustion had probably influenced the way I interpreted the sounds. I returned to the Airbnb a little after 7 that evening. Before even putting my things in the bedroom, I decided to look for the attic the owner had mentioned. At the end of the hallway, there was a small ceiling hatch with a wooden frame and a metal ring hanging from the center. It wasn't very large, but it clearly provided access to the space above the house. I stood there staring at it for several seconds. There was no fixed staircase, just the closed hatch. That explained why I hadn't noticed it the night before. Even so, if someone really had been walking around up there, they would have had to climb through that single opening. I ran my hand along the wooden frame, looking for signs of recent use. There was some dust, but there were also several cleaner areas near the metal ring, as though someone had grabbed it not very long ago. I considered opening the hatch to take a look, but quickly decided against it. I didn't have a ladder tall enough to reach it, and it didn't seem wise to risk climbing into a cramped attic inside a house that wasn't even mine. I checked every door and window once more, locked everything again, ate dinner while watching television, and tried to behave normally. Even so, before turning off the lights, I glanced down the hallway one more time. The attic hatch remained closed exactly as before, but for the first time since arriving, I genuinely felt uncomfortable being alone in that house. On the second night, I went to bed earlier, but I left my phone fully charged on the bedside table and placed a flashlight beside the bed. Not because I truly believed someone was in the attic, but because I had become increasingly uneasy about the situation. Shortly after midnight, I woke once again to the exact same sound I had heard the previous night. The footsteps began slowly, directly above the bedroom. I remained perfectly still, listening as carefully as I could. This time, they were much easier to identify because the house was completely silent. The footsteps were heavy enough that I could feel faint vibrations traveling through the ceiling, followed by long pauses. At one point, I heard a different sound, as though something had been dragged across the wooden floor for several seconds. My first instinct was to get up and look into the hallway, but I convinced myself it was probably just another false impression. I stayed in bed trying to think logically. Maybe a large animal like a raccoon had gotten into the attic. That would explain the sounds without involving anything more unusual. Even so, something didn't fit. The rhythm of the footsteps was far too regular. Animals usually run, stop abruptly, or make irregular noises. This sounded exactly like someone walking slowly, changing direction and then walking back the same way. The sounds continued for about 10 minutes before stopping completely. The following morning, I had already decided I was leaving before my scheduled checkout time. I packed my clothes, closed my suitcase, and began carrying my belongings into the living room. As I walked down the hallway, I stopped immediately. The attic hatch was open. The retractable wooden ladder, which had been completely hidden inside the ceiling the night before, was now fully extended to the floor. I stared at it, unable to understand what I was seeing. I was absolutely certain I had never opened that ladder. The house was still locked from the inside exactly as I had left it before going to bed. I took 2 steps backward and shined my phone's flashlight into the attic. I couldn't see very much. Only wooden beams and several old boxes. Then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Right beside the opening was a thin mattress spread out across the wooden floor. I could also make out several empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a folded blanket. It didn't look like a forgotten storage area. It looked like a place where someone had been living for several days. I didn't climb the ladder. At that moment, the only thing I could think about was getting out of that house as quickly as possible. I hurried down the front steps, practically carrying my suitcase, and climbed into my car before I had even finished loading everything into the trunk. As soon as I started the engine, I drove a short distance away from the house and stopped to call the police. I explained that I was staying in an Airbnb and had found clear evidence that someone might have been living secretly inside the attic. While waiting for the officers to arrive, I remained inside my car watching the front of the house. At no point did I see anyone leave through the front door or any of the windows. About 15 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. I told them everything, from the footsteps during the first night to finding the attic ladder open that morning. One of them entered the house with me only as far as the hallway, took a quick look into the attic, and asked me to wait outside while they searched the rest of the property. The search lasted several minutes. When they finished, one of the officers confirmed that there were indeed clear signs someone had been living in that space for some time. They found clothing, food, medication packages, a flashlight, and several other personal belongings. However, no one was there when they conducted the search. They also discovered a small opening at one end of the attic, leading onto the roof through an old ventilation opening, large enough for a thin person to squeeze through after removing a metal screen that had only been loosely fitted into place. Later that day, I spoke with the Airbnb owner over the phone. He sounded just as surprised as I was and said he had never imagined someone could gain access through that opening. The house sometimes sat vacant between reservations, and there had probably never been any reason for anyone to inspect the attic. A few days later, one of the police officers called to let me know that the investigation was still ongoing, but that they still hadn't identified whoever had been using the attic. They also had no idea how long it had been happening. I never received another update. Since then, I still travel frequently for work, but I've almost completely stopped booking entire houses in isolated places. These days, I prefer hotels even if they cost a little more. I still think about that first night and how hard I tried convincing myself those footsteps were nothing more than old wood creaking. What truly gives me chills isn't imagining that someone was hiding above the bedroom where I was sleeping. It's remembering that I spent 2 nights believing I was completely alone, While there were clear signs that someone else knew that house far better than I did, and probably knew exactly when I arrived, when I slept, and when I left. Story 2. My name is Megan Foster. I'm 35 years old and I work as a graphic designer in Minneapolis. During the summer of 2024, I was going through an especially stressful period at work, so I decided to spend an entire weekend completely by myself. My plan was to get away from the city for 2 days with no meetings, no traffic, and no phone constantly ringing. I found a small Airbnb on the shore of a lake near Brainerd, in central Minnesota. The listing showed a simple wooden cabin with a porch overlooking the water and very few neighboring houses. It was exactly the kind of place I was looking for. I arrived early Friday afternoon after driving for about 3 hours. The owner had sent all the check-in instructions through the app and explained that I would check in by myself, using a lockbox attached to the porch railing. As soon as I parked, I noticed how quiet the place was. Besides the house where I would be staying, there was only one other residence visible a short distance away, separated by a few trees and a narrow stretch of lawn. The lake was perfectly calm, and there was almost no activity anywhere. I unloaded my luggage, put a few things away in the kitchen, and spent my first few minutes simply enjoying the peace and quiet I had been hoping to find that weekend. I was still unpacking when I heard someone call out from the porch. At first, I assumed it was the owner, but instead I found a man who looked to be in his early 60s standing near the front steps. He wore a faded baseball cap, a plaid shirt, and held a coffee mug in one hand. He introduced himself simply as Frank, and pointed toward the neighboring house, saying he'd lived there for many years. The conversation began completely normally. He asked where I was from, mentioned that the lake usually became crowded during the summer, and said the area rarely had any problems. Before leaving, however, he made a comment that struck me as slightly unusual. He said he always kept an eye on the vacation rentals whenever guests were away during the day, because teenagers sometimes tried sneaking onto the properties to fish or throw parties by the lake. I thanked him for looking out for the neighborhood and replied that I would probably spend almost the entire weekend at the house anyway. He simply smiled, wished me a pleasant weekend, and slowly walked back toward his own home. At the time, I didn't think anything was wrong. If anything, I figured he was simply one of those friendly neighbors who knows everyone in the area and enjoys chatting with newcomers. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking along the lakeshore, reading on the porch and enjoying the silence. The place looked exactly like it had in the listing photographs. There was a small wooden dock, several chairs facing the water, and a barbecue grill beside the house. The only other people I saw were a couple fishing far across the lake. After that, I hardly saw anyone else. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner, locked every door and window, watched a movie, and went to bed. Before turning out the lights, I glanced through the living room window. A few lights were still on in Frank's house, but I couldn't see anyone outside. I went to bed shortly before 11 and fell asleep almost immediately after the long drive and an exhausting week. I have no idea how long I had been asleep before I suddenly woke to the sound of wood creaking just outside my bedroom window. I remained perfectly still for several seconds, trying to identify what had awakened me. Then I heard it again. It sounded like someone walking slowly across the wooden boards of the front porch. The footsteps were slow, evenly spaced, and separated by short pauses, as though whoever was out there was deliberately trying to make as little noise as possible. My first thought was that some larger animal had climbed onto the porch. Near lakes, it wasn't unusual for raccoons or even deer to wander around during the night. Even so, the sounds were far too regular to belong to an animal. Without making a sound, I picked up my phone and slowly walked toward the bedroom window. The curtains were thick, so I pulled them back only enough to see the porch through a narrow opening. The moment I looked outside, my entire body froze. The man who had introduced himself as Frank was standing just a few steps from the front door. He was holding a flashlight pointed toward the ground and remained completely motionless, staring at the house. At first, I thought he might have seen something unusual and was trying to warn me. But before I could open the window or call out to him, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A second person was slowly walking around the back of the house. I couldn't make out the face because it was too dark. All I could see was the outline of someone silently moving between the trees. Frank wasn't looking toward that person. He wasn't shining his flashlight in that direction either. He simply remained standing in front of the door, as though he were waiting for something. For several seconds, I tried to understand what was happening. I wondered whether Frank had noticed someone lurking around the property and had come over specifically to investigate. That would have matched what he had told me earlier that afternoon about watching over the rental houses. Even so, one detail bothered me. If he was really trying to protect me, why hadn't he knocked on the door or called my name? He simply stood there holding the flashlight without illuminating the area around him. Meanwhile, the other person continued walking around the back of the house with remarkable patience. I heard dry branches snapping underfoot, followed by the sound of someone moving near the kitchen windows. My heart began pounding. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. Before pressing the call button, however, I looked through the window once more. Frank was still standing in exactly the same place. He appeared to be watching only the front door. The second person disappeared behind the house, and I could no longer see them. At that moment, I had the overwhelming feeling that if I turned on a light or made any noise, both of them would immediately realize I was awake. I stayed crouched beside the window, listening carefully to everything happening outside. After nearly a full minute of complete silence, I heard a metallic sound coming from the back of the house as though someone had carefully tested the kitchen door handle. A moment later, I heard the same sound coming from one of the side windows. They weren't loud bangs. They sounded like quiet attempts to see whether any door or window had been left unlocked. That was the moment I pressed the button and called the police. Keeping my voice as low as possible, I explained that I was alone in an Airbnb and that 2 people were walking around the house during the middle of the night. The dispatcher instructed me to remain hidden, stay inside the bedroom, and keep the line open until officers arrived. While we were talking, I looked once more through the small gap in the curtain. Frank finally moved. He took a few slow steps across the porch, briefly shined his flashlight toward the front door, then walked along the side of the house until he disappeared from view. At that point, I could no longer see either of them. That was the worst part. I knew they were still somewhere outside. I just had no idea where. The next several minutes felt far longer than they actually were. I remained sitting on the bedroom floor with the lights off and my phone on speaker, quietly answering the dispatcher's questions. She repeatedly instructed me not to leave the room and assured me that officers were already on their way. While waiting, I heard a few more footsteps crunching across the gravel beside the house. Then everything became completely silent. That silence made me even more nervous than the noises had. At one point, I saw the beam of a flashlight sweep briefly across the living room window, illuminating part of the wall for less than a second. I couldn't tell whether it was Frank's flashlight or the other person's. A short time later, I heard the distant sound of a police siren. It still seemed far away, but in a place that quiet, it was impossible to miss. Almost simultaneously, I heard quick footsteps running away along the side of the house. When the patrol car's lights finally appeared on the road leading to the lake, I found the courage to leave the bedroom. The officers conducted a complete search around the property. They found fresh footprints near the back door and close to the fence separating the 2 properties, but no one was there anymore. The kitchen door also had several small scratches around the lock, as though someone had unsuccessfully tried to force it open using a thin tool. Once everything had settled down, one of the officers went next door to speak with Frank. He confirmed that he had indeed walked over to the porch during the night. He said he had seen an unfamiliar person walking near the property and had decided to observe from a distance before calling the police. According to him, when he noticed the man moving toward the back of the house, he followed him along the side of the property so he wouldn't lose sight of him. He claimed that once he heard the approaching sirens, the intruder ran into the woods behind the houses and disappeared. The officers searched the surrounding area that night but found no one. Before I left the following morning, one of them told me that attempted break-ins at vacation rentals weren't uncommon when criminals realized guests were staying alone. That explanation made sense and was probably exactly what had happened. Even so, there's one detail I've never been able to forget. When I think back to that night, the image that always comes to mind isn't the man walking around the back of the house. It's Frank standing perfectly still on my porch, silently holding a flashlight for several minutes while staring at the front door as though he were waiting for someone to open it. To this day, I still don't know whether he was protecting the house or simply watching to see what would happen next. Story 3. My name is Jordan. I'm 29 years old and I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. This happened in late spring of 2024 when my friend Dylan and I decided to spend a weekend fishing at a lake near Hayward. We took trips like that at least once a year, and we almost always rented an Airbnb instead of staying in a hotel. It was cheaper, and we usually ended up much closer to the water. This time we chose a renovated old farmhouse, isolated from the main road and surrounded by trees. The listing said the house was more than 100 years old, but had been modernized inside. The reviews were excellent, and many guests specifically praised how quiet the place was. We arrived on Friday a little after 4 in the afternoon. The owner wasn't there. As usual, he had left the key in a lockbox attached to the porch railing and sent all the instructions through the app. Among his messages was one note that caught our attention. He simply asked that we not try to open a small door located beneath the staircase in the living room, explaining that it led to an old utility space that was no longer in use and could be dangerous because of the wooden support beams. We thought it was an unusual request, but we didn't pay much attention to it. Old houses always seem to have some strange compartment the owners prefer to keep closed. After putting our backpacks away, we started exploring the house. It was larger than it had looked in the pictures. The floors creaked quite a bit. The walls were covered in light-colored wood paneling, and a staircase led upstairs to 2 bedrooms. While Dylan was checking out the kitchen, I found the very door the host had mentioned. It was located directly beneath the staircase, stood just over 3 feet tall, and was made of dark wood with an old-fashioned lock and a small iron handle. It didn't look like an ordinary closet. There was also nothing suggesting it housed electrical equipment or plumbing access. It was simply a small door, completely closed. We joked that it probably hid some weird collection or a storage space full of junk. Out of curiosity, I grabbed the handle, but it was definitely locked. Since we didn't want to cause any problems on the very first day, we forgot about it and went fishing until sunset. We returned tired, made dinner, watched a baseball game on television, and went to bed shortly before midnight. The last thing I remember before turning out the lights was walking past the staircase and briefly glancing at the little door. It looked exactly as it had before, silent and completely closed. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. The bedroom was completely dark, and for a few seconds I thought I had simply woken up for no reason. Then I heard the sound again. It sounded like someone slowly turning a metal doorknob. I remained perfectly still, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Since the bedroom was directly above the living room, I realized the noise was coming from downstairs. A few seconds later, I heard a dull thud, followed by another one as though someone was pushing against a door that wouldn't open. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was just after 2 in the morning. My first thought was that Dylan had gotten up to get a drink of water or look for something in the kitchen. But before I even got out of bed, I heard him quietly call my name from across the hallway. I opened my bedroom door and found Dylan standing outside his room. The expression on his face made it obvious that he had heard the noise too. The first thing he asked was, "Are you messing with that door downstairs?" I told him I wasn't. We stood there silently for several seconds before hearing the doorknob turn once again, followed by 3 slow knocks against the wood. The sounds weren't coming from the front door or the back door. They were coming from the small door beneath the staircase. We walked downstairs together, trying to make as little noise as possible. Neither of us was truly frightened at that point. We assumed some animal had somehow gotten into part of the house. I kept my phone's flashlight aimed at the steps while Dylan turned on only the kitchen light, leaving the living room mostly in shadow. The moment we reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound stopped completely. We stood there staring at the door without saying a word. It remained closed exactly as it had been before we went to bed. Dylan leaned his ear against the wood and stood perfectly still, listening. I stayed a few feet behind him, watching the hallway. After nearly a minute of complete silence, he gestured that he couldn't hear anything anymore. I suggested it might be a raccoon trapped inside the wall or some other larger animal. While we were talking, we heard the doorknob again. This time we were standing less than 6 feet away. Both of us clearly saw the metal handle rotate downward a few inches before slowly returning to its original position, exactly as though someone on the other side was trying to open it from inside. Neither of us touched the door. We simply stepped backward at the same time, unable to come up with any immediate explanation. We spent several more seconds staring at the door without saying a word. Dylan was the first to break the silence. He said there was probably some old mechanism inside the lock, and that vibrations from the house might somehow be making the handle move. Even he didn't sound convinced. It was simply the only remotely logical explanation either of us could imagine. I pulled out my phone and started recording the door, hoping to capture any further movement. We remained there for almost 5 minutes. Nothing happened. Just as I was about to stop recording, we heard another muffled sound coming from the other side of the wood. This time, it wasn't the doorknob. It sounded like someone slowly dragging a hand across the inside of the door. Then came 2 short knocks, separated by a pause, followed by another attempt to turn the handle. This time, the movement was much stronger. The handle rotated all the way before snapping back with a metallic click. Acting on impulse, Dylan stepped forward as though he were about to ask who was in there, but I grabbed his arm before he could say anything. Neither of us had any idea what was behind that door, or why the owner had insisted so strongly that it remain closed. A few seconds later, everything became silent again. We decided to push the living room couch closer to the staircase and stay awake until sunrise. The rest of the night passed painfully slowly. Neither of us managed to fall asleep again. We talked quietly, trying to come up with explanations for what we had heard. Sometimes the house returned to complete silence. Other times we heard ordinary creaks coming from the old wooden structure, but the handle on the small door never moved again. As soon as daylight began to appear, we walked straight over to it. The first thing that caught our attention was a series of fresh marks on the outside of the wood. There were several thin scratches near the lock. Just beneath the handle were 5 long marks where a light layer of dust had been disturbed, as though fingers had pressed against that spot sometime during the night. I ran my hand across them to confirm they hadn't been there the previous day. The surrounding dust remained undisturbed, but those marks were clearly much newer. Dylan photographed everything before either of us touched anything else. That's when we decided to call the host and tell him exactly what had happened during the night. It took him several minutes to answer. When he finally picked up, the very first thing he asked was whether we had tried opening that door. I told him we hadn't. I explained the noises, the moving handle, and the marks we had found that morning. There were several seconds of silence on the other end of the line. Then he asked us not to stay near the door and said he would arrive at the property in about 40 minutes. While we waited, the two of us continued examining the rest of the house, trying to understand how that compartment had been built. When the owner arrived, he brought a ring full of old keys. He seemed far more concerned than I had expected. Without saying much, he unlocked the small door and slowly pulled it open. Behind it wasn't a basement or a closet. There was an extremely narrow passageway, barely wide enough for someone to walk through sideways, built between the walls of the house. The corridor stretched several yards alongside the staircase and disappeared deeper into the structure. The host explained that the house had been built in the late 19th century, and that the passage had originally been used to access plumbing and structural areas during repairs. Eventually, it had been closed because it no longer served any purpose. We shined our flashlights inside and walked only a few yards. There was heavy dust, cobwebs, and old wooden beams everywhere. Even so, in several places, the dust appeared to have been disturbed recently, as though something had passed through not very long before. The owner called the police that same morning. After conducting a more thorough inspection, the officers discovered a hidden opening at the far end of the passage behind an old wooden panel that led into the wall space of an exterior storage building on the property. The opening wasn't visible from inside the house and allowed someone to enter the passage without using the door beneath the staircase. They also found several empty food wrappers, a bottle of water, and an old blanket hidden in a more distant corner of the passage. No one was there when they searched, and I never found out whether they ever identified whoever had been using that space. The host immediately removed the Airbnb listing so he could renovate the entire structure and permanently seal off that hidden access. Dylan and I left later that same afternoon. I still enjoy taking fishing trips to this day, but ever since then I've avoided renting very old vacation houses. What stayed with me the most wasn't discovering there had been a hidden passage inside the walls. It was realizing that while we were asleep upstairs, someone or something had been trying to open the one and only door separating that narrow corridor from the living room where we were staying. Story 4. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 39 years old and I live with my wife Rachel in Charlotte, North Carolina. In October 2024, we celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary and decided to spend a weekend away from the city. We found an Airbnb in the mountains near Bryson City, surrounded by forest and overlooking a beautiful valley. The house was small but highly rated. The photos showed a large porch, a fireplace, and plenty of privacy, exactly what we were looking for. We arrived on Friday afternoon after a little more than a 3-hour drive. The host wasn't there, but he had sent all the instructions through the app and told us the key would be in a lockbox attached to the porch railing. We spent the first day hiking nearby trails, had dinner at a restaurant in town, and returned early to get some sleep. Everything was perfectly normal. The house was quiet, well-maintained, and nothing about it stood out. On Saturday, we followed a similar routine, spending most of the day exploring the area before returning in the early evening to prepare a simple dinner and enjoy the fireplace. At no point did we feel there was anything wrong with that place. It wasn't until the second night that we began noticing small things which by themselves didn't seem to mean anything. While Rachel was making coffee, I stepped outside to retrieve a backpack I had left in the car. When I came back inside, I noticed that one of the kitchen chairs had been pulled slightly away from the table. I assumed my wife had used it, but she said she hadn't sat there since breakfast. We laughed about it and concluded that one of us had probably just forgotten where we'd left the chair. Later that evening, we drove into Bryson City for dinner and were gone for about 2 hours. Before leaving, we quickly checked that all the lights were off and locked the house. When we returned, we found the light in the small hallway turned on. None of the other lights were. At first, I thought we had simply forgotten to switch it off, but Rachel insisted she had because she always checked the lights before leaving. Even so, we chose not to worry about it. Before going to bed, I made one final walk through the house, checking every door and window. I distinctly remember closing a small laundry room window because the temperature had dropped considerably, and cold air was blowing in through it. I locked the latch, tested the handle, and we went to bed believing everything was secure. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling unusually cold. At first, I assumed the fire had gone out completely and the house had cooled down. I got up just enough to pull back the bedroom curtain, and that's when I realized the cold air was coming from the direction of the laundry room. I quietly walked down the hallway, trying not to wake Rachel. When I got there, I found the small window open several inches. I stood there staring at it, completely confused. I clearly remembered closing it before going to bed. For several seconds, I tried convincing myself that maybe I hadn't fully latched it, and that the wind had managed to push it open. I closed it again, checked the latch twice, and returned to the bedroom. Before getting back into bed, I glanced toward the living room. The kitchen chair was still sitting out of place. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit, but it still didn't seem like enough to conclude that anything was actually wrong. I lay back down and had a hard time falling asleep again. The feeling was that I was trying to connect several small details that, individually, still had perfectly ordinary explanations. I have no idea how much time passed before I woke up again. This time it wasn't the cold that woke me. I heard a very faint sound coming from the front entrance of the house. At first I thought it was a tree branch brushing against the porch because of the wind. Then I heard a very distinctive metallic click. It was exactly the sound of a key slowly turning inside a lock. I immediately sat upright in bed and looked over at Rachel. She had opened her eyes at exactly the same moment. Neither of us moved. A few seconds later came another click, followed by the careful sound of a doorknob being turned. The front door slowly began to open. There was no forced entry, no pounding, no other unusual noise, just someone unlocking the door exactly the way they would when arriving home. Instinctively, I turned off my phone's screen so no light would be visible in the bedroom. We remained absolutely silent while listening to slow footsteps entering the living room. They were calm, unhurried footsteps. From the way the person moved, I had the distinct impression that they already knew the layout of the house perfectly and didn't need to search for anything in the dark. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. The bedroom door was only slightly ajar, leaving a narrow gap facing the hallway. Without making any sudden movement, I carefully placed one eye against the opening. The only illumination came from the faint porch light filtering through the living room windows. Even so, I could make out the silhouette of a man slowly walking through the house. He was wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap, and holding a small flashlight pointed toward the floor, illuminating only enough to see where he was walking. At no point did he seem surprised to be there. He didn't appear to be searching for valuables or rummaging through drawers. Instead, he walked from room to room like someone who already knew the floor plan by heart. He entered the kitchen, opened one cabinet, closed it again, and continued down the hallway toward the laundry room. He stood there for several seconds beside the same window I had found open earlier, before returning to the living room. Rachel was gripping my arm so tightly that it actually hurt. Very slowly, I picked up my phone and sent an emergency text to 911 with the property's address, simply stating that there was an intruder inside the house and that we were hiding in the bedroom. For several more minutes, we listened to the man walking through the rest of the house. At no point did he try to open the bedroom door. In fact, he seemed to avoid that room on purpose. After a while, we once again heard the sound of the key turning inside the lock. I waited several seconds before approaching the bedroom window. Through a small gap in the curtain, I saw him crossing the porch and disappearing toward the area where the cars were parked. I couldn't make out any vehicle because it was still too dark. Less than 10 minutes later, the police arrived. The officers conducted a complete search of both the house and the surrounding property, but found no one. There were no signs of forced entry on any door or window. When I explained that the man had used a key to get inside, one of the officers immediately asked the host how many copies of that key existed. The owner replied that besides his own, there was only the one kept inside the lockbox for guests. The answer seemed to settle the matter, but one of the officers insisted that he check his old maintenance records and reservation files. The host's expression changed immediately, as though he had suddenly remembered something. The host asked for a few minutes to look through documents stored on the laptop he kept in the house next door. Meanwhile, the officers continued examining the front door lock. They found no signs of tampering whatsoever. The key had worked normally. About 20 minutes later, the owner returned looking visibly shaken. He explained that several years earlier, he had used a different check-in system. Instead of a lockbox, he personally gave a spare key to guests who arrived late at night. According to him, every copy was supposed to have been returned, but there was an old record of one couple who claimed they had lost one during their stay. At the time, he believed the key had genuinely been misplaced and simply had another one made, so he could continue renting the property. He never replaced the lock cylinder because he considered it highly unlikely that someone would ever find the lost key and figure out which house it belonged to. One of the officers explained that situations like that happened far more often than most people realized. All it took was for someone to know the address and keep that copy for years in order to enter without forcing anything. While we were talking, I noticed another detail that sent a chill down my spine. The man had never turned on a single light during the entire time he was inside the house. That meant he already knew exactly where the furniture, hallways, and every door were located. The following morning, we officially documented everything before leaving. That same day, the host hired a locksmith to replace every lock, install electronic locks, and add security cameras facing both the porch and the entrance to the property. Several weeks later, he contacted us to say that one of the newly installed cameras had recorded a man walking near the house during the middle of the night, but he fled before the police arrived. They never identified him or proved he was the same person who had entered while we were staying there. They also never discovered whether he was actually the former guest who had never returned the key, or someone who had received it from him years later. Since then, Rachel and I have continued traveling, but we've completely changed our habits. We always ask hosts when the locks were last replaced and whether every old key has been permanently deactivated. Before that trip, I had never considered that a single forgotten key could turn an apparently safe house into a place where a complete stranger could walk inside in the middle of the night as though they still lived there. Story 5. My name is Emma, and this happened to me during the summer of 2023 when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was finishing my biology degree at a university in Tennessee and needed to submit my thesis shortly after the summer break. Since I shared an apartment with 2 other students and there was always noise, I decided to rent a small cabin through Airbnb near Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My plan was to spend 4 days completely isolated so I could finish writing the last chapters of my paper without distractions. The cabin was located at the end of a narrow gravel road, surrounded by tall trees and far from any neighboring properties. The host explained that the area was very quiet, and that during the week it was common to go for hours without seeing another car. That sounded perfect for what I needed. I brought my laptop, several books, enough food for a few days, and had no intention of leaving until I finished writing. I spent the first afternoon organizing my notes and working by the living room window, where the only view was the wooden porch and the forest beyond it. That first night, a steady rain fell for several hours. It wasn't a heavy storm, just the kind of light rain that keeps the trees dripping long after it stops. I kept writing until almost midnight while listening to nothing but the sound of rain hitting the cabin's metal roof. Before going to bed, I checked that every door and window was locked, turned off the lights, and went into my bedroom. I slept deeply and didn't wake up until around 8 in the morning, when the sun was already shining across part of the porch. I made some coffee and opened the bedroom curtains to let in a little sunlight. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze for several seconds. There were wet boot prints on the wooden boards of the porch. They began at the front steps, crossed the entire length of the porch, and ended directly in front of the window where I had been sleeping. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to get a better look. The prints were clear, recent, and sharply defined by the rainwater. What was truly strange was that I couldn't find any footprints leading away in the opposite direction. It looked as though someone had simply walked up to my bedroom window and disappeared there. A few minutes later, I stepped outside to examine the footprints more closely. The wood was still damp, making the prints easy to distinguish. They were large boot prints with deep tread patterns, completely different from the sneakers I was wearing. I slowly walked across the entire porch, searching for some explanation. The prints began at the first step and continued in a straight line to my bedroom window. There, they simply ended. I thought maybe the wood had dried faster somewhere else and erased the rest of the trail, so I climbed down to check the ground around the cabin. The soil was still soaked from the previous night's rain, but I couldn't find any continuation. There were no prints beside the porch, near the trees, or behind the cabin. There was also no indication that someone had walked away in another direction. The situation was strange enough to make me uncomfortable, but I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe someone had walked across the porch before the rain had fully stopped, and the rest of the prints simply hadn't remained visible. I took a few pictures with my phone, more out of curiosity than concern, and sent a message to the host asking whether anyone had come to the property during the night. He replied about an hour later, saying no. He was in another town and no one had permission to enter the cabin during my stay. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my thesis, but my attention kept drifting back to the bedroom window. Every time I took a break to rest my eyes, I found myself looking toward the porch almost automatically. Absolutely nothing happened throughout the afternoon. The silence was so complete that all I could hear was the wind moving through the leaves and, every now and then, a bird landing on the roof. By early evening, I made myself a simple dinner, revised a few more pages of my paper, and started thinking that maybe I had exaggerated the importance of the footprints. Before going to bed, I checked every lock once again, closed the curtains, and left only a small lamp on in the living room. It was already past 11 when I heard a dull sound coming from the porch. It sounded like the weight of someone walking slowly across the wooden boards. One step, then another, each one spaced apart and heavy enough to make the structure creak slightly. I remained perfectly still in bed, trying to convince myself it might be a branch falling or some large animal. But the rhythm was too regular. It sounded exactly like the footsteps of a person walking outside the cabin. I listened for nearly a minute without moving. The footsteps remained slow, moving across the porch as though someone were pacing back and forth. I quietly picked up my phone and considered calling the police, but I hesitated. I hadn't actually seen anyone, only heard the sounds, and I knew that isolated cabins often make noises because of shifting wood and changing temperatures. Even so, there was something different about those footsteps. The creaks weren't random. They were heavy and evenly spaced, always following a pattern that sounded remarkably like someone walking. Then I remembered something. As long as the living room light was on, anyone outside could clearly see almost the entire interior of the cabin. While I could barely see through the reflection in the glass, I slowly got out of bed, walked to the bedroom door, and without making any noise switched off the living room lamp. The cabin was plunged into complete darkness. I waited several seconds for my eyes to adjust before carefully approaching the window, keeping my face away from the glass so it wouldn't reflect any movement. That's when I saw a silhouette standing outside. There was someone standing directly in front of my bedroom window. The person wasn't moving at all. They weren't knocking on the glass, calling out, or trying to open the window. They were simply standing there, staring into the cabin. We were separated by little more than 3 feet of glass. Even in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, I could make out that the person was wearing dark clothing and appeared to have either a cap or a hood covering part of their head. My heart started pounding so hard that I was afraid the person might actually hear it. I stayed crouched down, watching through a narrow gap between the curtain and the window. After almost a full minute without making a single movement, the figure finally turned its head as though hearing something coming from the woods. Then it took 2 steps to the side, slowly disappearing from my view. I kept waiting for the person to reappear or for the sound of footsteps moving away across the porch, but I didn't hear anything else. The silence returned so suddenly that it was almost impossible to believe someone had been standing there only moments earlier. I waited several more minutes before finally gathering the courage to call 911. I explained that someone had been standing outside my cabin looking through the bedroom window and that I was alone in an isolated area. The dispatcher instructed me to remain inside with every door locked until deputies from the sheriff's office arrived. It took them about 30 minutes to reach the property, which made sense given how remote it was, but every minute felt much longer. When I finally saw the patrol car's lights coming up the access road, I felt immediate relief. I told the deputies everything that had happened and showed them the pictures of the footprints I had taken that morning. One officer walked the entire length of the porch with a flashlight while the other searched the area around the cabin. Just a few yards beyond the wooden steps, they found fresh boot prints in the damp soil leading toward the forest. The tracks disappeared into the dense vegetation, where it would have been impossible to continue searching safely during the night. One of the deputies commented that, unfortunately, it wasn't the first time they had received reports of people watching rental cabins in extremely isolated areas. In most cases, those responsible took advantage of the fact that the guests were alone and far from any neighbors. The following morning, I packed my belongings and left the cabin before I had even finished my thesis. I completed it a few days later back at my apartment, surrounded by the very noise I had been trying to escape. The host apologized for what had happened and said he would install security cameras facing the porch and the entrance to the property. I never found out who the person outside my window was that night, or how long they had been watching before I turned off the lights. What stayed with me most was realizing how something as simple as changing the lighting completely changed the situation. While the cabin was brightly lit, I was the one exposed without realizing it. It wasn't until I turned off every light that I was finally able to see who was actually outside. Ever since then, whenever I stay alone in a cabin or an isolated house, I close the curtains as soon as it gets dark and avoid leaving the interior fully illuminated. Maybe that person was simply waiting for an opportunity to find out whether I was truly alone. And that possibility alone was enough to make me never look at a window the same way again. Story 6. My name is Ryan Collins. I'm 30 years old and I live in Burlington, Vermont. During the winter of 2024, 2 longtime friends, Mark and Tyler, suggested that we rent an Airbnb for a weekend away from the city. The plan was to enjoy the snow, go hiking during the day, and simply relax at night. We found an old wooden house in a rural area near Stowe. It was set back from the main road, surrounded by pine trees with very few neighboring properties. The listing said the house had recently been renovated, but still preserved much of its original structure. The reviews were excellent, and nearly every guest mentioned how incredibly quiet the place was. We arrived on a Friday in the late afternoon. The owner greeted us in person, showed us the kitchen, the living room with the fireplace, the 2 bedrooms we would be using, and briefly explained how the heating system worked. Before leaving, he made only one comment that seemed completely ordinary at the time. He said there was a 3rd bedroom at the end of the hallway that would remain locked because it was being used as a storage room for tools, old furniture, and maintenance supplies. He simply asked that we not try to open it since heavy objects were stored inside. We agreed without asking any questions. We had no reason to be interested in a simple storage room. After he left, we unloaded the car, lit the fireplace, and spent most of the evening talking and playing cards. The house was comfortable, and the heating system worked well despite the constant creaking of the wood caused by the freezing temperatures outside. At one point, I walked down the hallway to retrieve a backpack I had left near the front door. As I passed the locked bedroom, I noticed the key was still in the lock, but it couldn't be turned from the outside because it was blocked. I thought it was a little odd, but I didn't give it much thought. We had dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed shortly before midnight. My bedroom was directly across from the locked room. Before turning off the light, I glanced briefly at the door. It remained completely still with no sounds coming from the other side. If someone had asked me at that moment what my biggest concern would be that weekend, I probably would have said the snowy roads on the drive home. I never imagined that the room the owner had casually described as nothing more than a storage space would become the very place where the sounds keeping us awake for most of the night would come from. I don't know how long I had been asleep before I woke up. The bedroom was completely dark, but I could clearly hear something coming from the hallway. It was the sound of slow footsteps on the wooden floor. At first, I assumed Mark or Tyler had gotten up to get a drink of water, but I quickly realized the footsteps weren't heading toward the kitchen. They seemed to remain directly in front of the locked bedroom. I stayed perfectly still for several seconds, listening more carefully. Then came a dull thump, followed by another one a few seconds later. It didn't sound like someone trying to force the door open. It sounded more like something bumping into the wall from inside the room. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was just after 2 a.m. At that moment, I heard Tyler quietly call my name from across the hallway. I opened my bedroom door and found both of them already awake. Mark had also left his room after hearing the same noises. The three of us stood silently staring at the closed door while more sounds came from the other side. First one footstep, then another. Then a brief dragging sound as though someone were moving an object across the wooden floor. None of us could understand how that was possible. When the owner had assured us the room was used only for storage, we slowly walked to the end of the hallway, illuminating the floor with nothing but our phone flashlights. The noises stopped the instant we approached the door. We stood there for nearly a full minute without hearing a single sound. Tyler suggested that maybe some animal had gotten into the attic and was moving around inside the walls. The explanation sounded reasonable until we heard 3 evenly spaced knocks coming unmistakably from inside the room. This time, there was no doubt the sound came directly from behind the door. On impulse, Mark reached for the doorknob, but it remained locked and wouldn't move. We even called out to the owner despite knowing he lived several miles away. No one answered. We returned to the living room and stayed awake beside the fireplace for the rest of the night. From time to time, the sounds returned. Sometimes they were slow footsteps. Other times they sounded like faint knocks against the wall or floor. They always lasted only a few seconds before stopping completely, as though whoever was inside paused the moment they realized we were listening. When morning came, the silence returned completely. With daylight streaming through the windows, everything seemed far less unsettling than it had during the night. We joked that perhaps the extreme cold had caused the old wood to shift in unusual ways, and that our imaginations had filled in the rest. Even so, none of us truly believed that explanation. We spent most of the day hiking a nearby trail and had lunch in town. When we returned that evening, I once again walked down the hallway and noticed the bedroom door remained locked exactly as it had the previous day. That second night, however, the sounds returned at almost the exact same time. Once again, we heard slow footsteps, faint knocks, and something being dragged across the floor for several seconds. This time, none of us left our bedrooms to investigate. Instead, we simply exchanged text messages confirming that we were all hearing the exact same thing. Shortly before sunrise, the noises stopped completely. Since we had already planned to head home that morning, we started packing our bags as soon as daylight arrived. While carrying our backpacks into the living room, Tyler was the first to notice something different. The bedroom door that had remained locked throughout our entire stay was now slightly open. All 3 of us stopped immediately. None of us had touched it, and we were certain it had still been closed only a few hours earlier. I slowly pushed the door open. The room was almost empty. There were no boxes of tools, no old furniture, and no maintenance supplies. Instead, there was only a thin mattress on the floor, a folded blanket, several pieces of clothing scattered in one corner, recent food wrappers, bottles of water, and an open backpack leaning against the wall. It didn't look like a storage room. It looked like a place where someone had been living until very recently. We were still standing there trying to process what we were seeing when we heard a loud noise coming from the front entrance. The front door slammed violently as though someone had just rushed out of the house. The 3 of us turned at the same time and ran into the living room. We reached the porch within seconds, but no one was there. It was still freezing outside and snow covered the ground around the house. The first thing I did was look toward the driveway leading to the parking area. Our car was still exactly where we'd left it. There was no vehicle driving away down the road. Mark called out loudly, but no one answered. As we walked around the outside of the house, we noticed a fresh set of footprints curving around the side of the building toward the forest. The snow was still only lightly compacted, indicating they had been made only a short time earlier. The tracks disappeared among the trees before we managed to spot anyone. We immediately went back inside, locked the door, and called the owner. When I explained that the bedroom door was open and described exactly what we had found inside, he remained silent for several seconds before asking whether we had touched anything. I told him we hadn't. He instructed us to leave the house immediately and wait for the police inside our car. About 20 minutes later, the officers arrived, searched the entire property, and followed the footprints through the woods until they lost the trail near a secondary road. They found no one. One of the officers explained that the clothing, food, and mattress strongly suggested someone had been using that room as a hiding place for quite some time, entering and leaving the house without the owner's knowledge. Before we left, the host told us that he rarely visited the property during the winter because he lived in another town and relied on guest reservations to let him know whether everything was in good condition. He genuinely believed that room was still nothing more than an old storage space because he hadn't opened it in months. We never found out how that person had gained access to the house or how long they had been living there. The police discovered a small rear window whose latch had been damaged from the inside, suggesting it may have been used to enter and leave without needing a key. What still bothers me most is remembering the sounds we heard during those 2 nights. While we were sleeping only a few yards away, someone was walking around inside that room, probably waiting for the right moment to leave without being seen. If we had decided to open that door during the night, instead of finding an empty storage room, we would have come face to face with someone hiding inside the very house where we were staying. Ever since then, whenever I rent an Airbnb, I pay much closer attention to any locked room and to any sound that doesn't seem to make sense. Sometimes the problem isn't an old house. It's discovering far too late that it was never truly empty.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.